Hello and welcome to this lecture in the IBM Cloud Foundation Skills Series. Now this lecture is going to focus on the two access and security models in the IBM Cloud, and this is going to be a rather long one. However, these are models that you're going to need at least some basic knowledge of to properly use and manage your account, so it's probably quite important that you try and stick with it and watch it to the end. I've put a break in halfway through, so if you are finding it hard going, I suggest you stop at that point and grab a cup of tea. So as a first couple of points, let's distinguish between the account owner and other users. As you might expect, the account owner is the user ID that owns the account, or often the one that set up the account in the first place. I say often because you can change the account owner, and there are good reasons for doing this. So another way to think of it is the account owner is the account with the email address that any bills get sent to. As the owner of the account, you can obviously do what you like in it. You're effectively the root or the administrator user. Now you can also invite other users to use an account, and you do this if you want others to, say, work on a project with you to build an application. So normally businesses with multiple developers will have an account, and all the developers will use the same account to develop in. Someone will be the account owner, perhaps the head of development, and they will invite those other developers to the account. To use someone else's account, you must first be invited, and by default you have no access rights or privileges on someone else's account. They must be granted to you. So as a quick aside, why would you change the account owner? Well, if it's a corporate account and the account owner is Jane Doe, the account will be tied to her email address, and all correspondence about the account, including the bills, will go to that address. This is great until Jane leaves the organisation, so then suddenly nobody has admin access to the account and none of the bills come through. However, Jane can still log in and use the account, which she would not be entitled to do any longer. At this point, you would want to change the account owner back to get control. However, you have to keep doing this every time the account owner leaves, or even just change his role. So the best solution to this is to actually set up a service ID, i.e. an account with an email address, that then becomes the account owner. So several people can have access to this account ID, which then means shared administrator access and no more ownership changes. Anyway, back to Cloud Foundry and IAM. So what are they, and what are they used for in IBM Cloud? Well, in basic terms, they are both models which are used in IBM Cloud to manage user access to your IBM Cloud account. Often these tend to be developers. It's not the users of actual applications, because that's handled in the application itself, but they can be audit users or users that just need to see billing information. Cloud Foundry is an open source cloud application platform. It's the underlying system that runs certain parts of the IBM Cloud platform. When IBM Cloud was launched, it was called Bluemix in those days, it was pretty much all based on Cloud Foundry. So services and applications that are based on Cloud Foundry are managed using the Cloud Foundry model, and this is based around organisations and spaces. So you'll probably see and hear those terms quite a bit, and when you do, you'll know that it's to do with the Cloud Foundry model. The problem with Cloud Foundry is that it isn't particularly granular, meaning that when you grant access, you can't just grant access to one service, and you can only connect services that are Cloud Foundry managed that are running in the same region. Now, granularity can be an issue for security on large enterprise apps, and the region restriction is a problem when you want to connect services that are geographically separated. So to combat this, IBM introduced Identity and Access Management in late 2017. This gives the granularity and geographical abstraction which allows organisations real control over access. And IBM has been and continues to migrate existing services to use IAM over Cloud Foundry management. The main phrase that you'll hear and see around IAM is resource groups, and we'll come on to that in a while. But if you hear or see a service needing or being in a resource group, then you'll know that service is IAM managed. One of the main things to bear in mind is that these are two separate management models. You must grant users access in each model. So for example, if a user is already an administrator under Cloud Foundry, they will still have no access to IAM managed resources. Right, so let's look a little bit more deeply at Cloud Foundry. So as I mentioned, Cloud Foundry uses organisations and spaces. When you actually provision a Cloud Foundry service, it gets placed into a space. When you create your account, you automatically get one organisation and one space. Now, if you have a light account, you're restricted to this single organisation of space, but if you upgrade to a pay-go or subscription account, this restriction is lifted. So in a pay-go or subscription account, your organisation can have multiple spaces. Now, a space is tied to a geographical region, for example London or Dallas, and once you have created your space, you cannot move it to another region. You must delete it and recreate it. When you create a Cloud Foundry managed service, it must reside in a space that sits in the same region. So for example, if you're creating a service hosted in Dallas, you must place it into a space that's also in Dallas. An organisation can contain spaces that have been created in multiple regions. So for example, space 1 might be London based, space 2 might be Dallas based, and so on. Note also that spaces cannot be moved between organisations, and services that you create in a space cannot be moved to another space. Also note that you cannot connect applications to services in different spaces, so this gives you separation. So here's another example of an organisation and space structure which probably highlights the separation point a bit better. Here the organisation is effectively an application project called rules, and then the spaces are named as environments, so we have dev, test and prod. The spaces are separated from one another and cannot share services. You can then grant access to users based on the space. So developers might get access to the dev space but not access to the test space, while only release admins might have access to the prod space. So now a bit more on Cloud Foundry configuration. Organisations are just logical constructs, and they are used to group together spaces. No services are actually created at organisational level, but you can grant access at the organisational level. Spaces have physical footprints, and as I mentioned, they must be created in a defined region, which is a geographical area. Normally you would use the region that is closest to your users, though there may be exceptions where, for example, services are not available in certain regions. You can actually have spaces in an organisation that have the same name, so two spaces called dev, for example, but they must be in different regions. I don't really recommend this because it gets confusing to manage. If you do need two dev spaces, then I would maybe call them London dev and Dallas dev, for example. Importantly, if you're creating a Cloud Foundry managed service, it has to be provisioned into a space that is in the same region. So you can't create a Cloud Foundry app or service that is hosted in Dallas into a space that is hosted in London. In fact, you won't even get the option. Bottom line is, to be able to create a Cloud Foundry service in a location, you must have a space in that location too. One of the things that you can do with IBM Cloud Services is connect them together. For example, if you have a Node.js application and you want to use a database service, you can connect the two services so that you don't have to worry about setting up all the usual connection parameters and so on in your application environment. It's all done for you. However, under the Cloud Foundry model, you can only connect up services that are in the same space. This can be a pain if you want to connect your app to a service that is not available in the same region, but it does prevent you from accidentally connecting your development application to your production database service, assuming they're in different spaces. So the last thing to note on this slide is that you can view billing information down to the space level. Now this can be really useful if you need to do some level of cross-billing in your company. If you set your organisations up as one per project or department, then you can pass that project or department an internal bill for their particular usage, as you can see a total per organisation. If you want to drill deeper, you can also see the cost of usage per space. So if you want to know how much development is costing, you can easily see it from the IBM Cloud billing dashboard, and I'll show you how to do this in a later video. So moving on, let's talk about the security model and specifically the roles you can grant in the Cloud Foundry model. And these are split into organisational roles and space roles. At the organisational level, you can grant roles which are called manager, billing manager, auditor, or no organisation role. The manager role lets you manage the organisation, so this lets you create spaces in the organisation as well as invite users and set up their access for the organisation. The billing manager role allows a user to see billing information for the organ, perform actions related to billing, while the auditor role will let a user see resources but not modify them. If the user requires none of these roles at the organisation level, they're assigned the no organisation role. Next, you assign space roles, and these can be for all or certain regions and then for all or certain spaces. The space roles are manager, developer and auditor. If you have the manager role, then this means you can manage the space, which includes inviting users to the space. With the developer role, you can configure, modify, use and purchase resources, all of which you really need to do a developer's job. Then, with the auditor role, you can view the resources, but you can't actually use them. Of course, you can assign multiple roles to a user. So, for example, if you have a developer that you want to be able to manage a space as well, you might grant the no organisation role, org role, then the manager and developer space roles. So let's quickly review what we've learned about Cloud Foundry. First, this is the older of the models as far as IBM Cloud is concerned and is less granular than IAM. It uses organisations and spaces, and light accounts are restricted to one org containing one space, whereas pay-go and subscription accounts can have multiple organisations and multiple spaces in each organisation. Spaces are created in a region, but an organisation can contain spaces which are all based in different regions. We've heard that a space cannot move between organisations or regions, and once a Cloud Foundry managed resource has been created in a space, that resource cannot move to another space. Of course, you can only create a resource if there is a space available in the same region. In terms of connecting Cloud Foundry managed applications and services, you can only connect them if they are in the same space, though you can connect any IAM managed service to a Cloud Foundry managed resource, no matter which region they are in. We heard that the account owner has full access to all organisations and spaces, and that other users will have to be invited and then granted privileges. By default, invited users have no privileges. Finally, users will need to be granted roles for each organisation or space, and any roles granted under Cloud Foundry will have no impact or access to IAM controlled resources. So we've just gone through Cloud Foundry and it's taken a little while, but as I said, having a good grasp of this stuff is important when it comes to managing your account. Before we move on to IAM, if you'd like to take a break, then I suggest you pause the video here, go and maybe make a cup of tea or have a quick walk about from your chair, and then come back and resume where we'll go into IAM. Okay, so welcome back if you decided to take a break. So let's move on now to Identity and Access Management. Now you may also hear this referred to via its initials, IAM, and people also talk about this as resource groups, but what we're essentially talking about here are resources which are managed by IAM. As I mentioned earlier, this was introduced to IBM Cloud in late 2017, and it provides a means to give much more granular access to resources than is possible under Cloud Foundry. And it also does away with the restrictions where Cloud Foundry managed resources provisioned in one region had to sit in a space in the same region. With resource groups, there's no link to a particular region, so you can provision resources from around the globe into a single resource group. Right, so let's look a bit more closely at how the IAM model actually works. Well, as I said, resources are deployed into resource groups, and a resource is basically an application, service instance, container cluster, storage volume, or virtual machine that is managed via IAM. Each IBM Cloud account therefore needs at least one resource group, and indeed every account comes with a resource group pre-created, which is called default. Now again, light accounts are restricted to a single resource group in the similar way that they can only have one organ space, but pay-go and subscription accounts can have multiple resource groups. So for example, one strategy that a pay-go or subscription account user might employ is to have one resource group per project environment. So for a project called Rules, they might create a resource group called Rules Dev RG, which would house all the development instances for the project. Moving on to talk more about the configuration of IAM then. So resource groups are logical constructs. They're a means of grouping together resources and providing separation, but they don't have any physical footprint, so are not tied to a particular region. When you create an IAM managed resource, it must be placed into a resource group, and you do this from within the catalogue when creating a service instance, for example. This is also the easiest way to tell if a resource is managed by IAM, as it will ask for a resource group at create time. If there's no resource group or your account doesn't have the right privilege levels to create the resource, you'll see messages to this effect when you try and create the resource. Resources from multiple regions can be placed into a single resource group, so there's no geographical restrictions. You can put services from London, Dallas and Sydney in the same group, for example. There will be times when you might want to connect a Cloud Foundry managed application to an IAM managed resource, object storage for example, and again you can do this and there are no regional geographical restrictions. Now access to IAM managed resources can be controlled at a much more granular level than in Cloud Foundry. So where we saw in Cloud Foundry that a developer could be granted developer rights to a space, that pretty much means that they can access and create whatever services they like in that space. With IAM you can go further because you can grant a developer access to a resource group but only allow them to access and create certain service types, Cloud and Service for example. Or you can even restrict them to a particular service instance, a particular Cloud instance or particular object storage bucket for example. So this is far more precise and far more secure as well. Also, you can grant access roles to service IDs. These are effectively applications. So if you have an application that needs to access a particular object storage bucket, you can configure this too. In terms of billing, you can view billing information down to the resource group level. So again, if you need to do cross-billing, you can see how much is being consumed by a particular resource group and raise an internal invoice accordingly. And in some cases, this will influence how you set up your resource groups. In terms of the security model, you can assign IAM roles to users and service IDs. A user is basically a person, whereas a service ID will be related to another IAM managed service. You assign access at two levels, those being the resource group level and the service access level. At the resource group level, you can assign roles which provide permissions to a user to view, edit or manage access for the resource group, but not actually provide access to the resources in the group. So with the viewer role, you can view the resources in the resource group but not modify them. With the editor role, you can perform all platform actions in the resource group, but you cannot manage the account or assign access policies. With the administrator role, you can perform all platform actions on the resource group, including assigning access to users. In terms of service access, you can either assign access to all IAM managed services in the resource group, or if you want to only grant access to a particular service type, for example Cloudant, you can assign roles for just that service. In each case, there are platform access roles for the service, and then there are service access roles. In terms of platform access roles, you have the administrator role, editor role, operator role, and the viewer role. The administrator role allows a user to perform all platform actions, including assigning access policies for other users on the resource type. The editor role will allow a user to perform all platform actions, but they cannot manage the account or assign access policies. This will allow you to create and change resources. An operator can configure and use service instances. So for example, they will be able to see a services dashboard. And as a viewer, you can see service instances in a resource group, but you can't modify them. Service access roles provide a user with access for using the service and performing API calls. Here we have the manager role, which allows you to carry out privileged actions on a service. The writer role, which allows a user to create and edit service-specific resources. And then the reader role, which allows the user to carry out read-only actions. Service access roles tend to change with the service they are attached to. So some services will have all three roles, some will have only one or two, and the way they are implemented can differ. Now these roles can take a bit of getting used to, and you may find that you need to experiment a bit to get them just right. I've had to spend a bit of time getting the roles right for granting access to an object storage bucket, for instance, and it does actually take a bit of trial and error to start with. I just wanted to mention access groups too. Now if you're the administrator of a large account with lots of services and users, granting access user by user is obviously going to be time consuming, and it can get complicated, knowing who has access to what. So the way around this is to use access groups. Here you can create an access group, assign access roles to the access group, and then add users to the access group so that they then inherit the access. If you want to then remove a user's access, you just remove them from the access group, and if you want to change the access, you can do it just once for the group rather than doing it over and over for each user. Okay, so let's do a quick review on what we've learnt on IAM. IAM was launched into IBM Cloud in 2017, and services are migrating from the Cloud Foundry management model to use IAM, while new services will use IAM by default. It's far more granular than Cloud Foundry, allowing you to manage access to the service instance level and to service IDs as well as users. It uses resource groups, so anything that is sitting in a resource group is IAM managed. Light accounts are restricted to only one resource group. Resource groups are not tied to regions, and IAM managed resources are created into resource groups, and these can be from around the globe. A resource is either an application, service instance, container cluster, storage volume, or virtual machine that is IAM managed. Once provisioned, a resource cannot change its resource group. Roles granted at the resource group level give no rights to the resources within them, and roles can be granted to users, service IDs, or access groups. An access group is a collection of users and or service IDs that need the same access roles, and this is a far quicker way to grant access to multiple users. And lastly, billing can be viewed down to the resource group level, which is important if you want to do cross-billing within your account and company. Okay, so we've learnt a lot so far, and there are just a few slides left where I wanted to show you some potential strategies. So in most cases, Cloud Foundry and IAM are going to exist side by side. So for a project called Rules, you might see the following structures, where you have a rules project organisation with a dev, test and prod spaces, and then 3 resource groups called rules dev, rules test and rules prod. With both of these models, you can have separation of environments, and you can see billing down to the project environment level. So as the account owner, remember that they have access to everything by default. You can't take away access rights from the account owner. If you don't want to have a regular user with this type of access, then I suggest you change the ownership to a service ID, as mentioned near the very start of the video. If you have a project leader or manager, or maybe a development manager, then their access might look like this. This is obviously very similar to the account owner, but here they have to be granted rights to the organisations and spaces and to the resource groups. If you're a developer, then your access might look more restricted still. so that you only have rights on the dev space and the dev resource group, again by granting the appropriate roles. And finally, you might want to give another service very granular access to a particular cloud object storage bucket. If you don't know what one of these is, look out for the cloud object storage section in this series. So you would grant this access by just granting that service ID specific service roles in IAM. A quick plug now for some further reading. And while I wrote this document, I think it's a pretty good place to go and read if you want to get some more information in a pretty digestible form, along with some examples on how to set up certain aspects of IAM. It's up on GitHub, so head off to that URL if you'd like to do some more reading. Okay, and that's it for this video. Well done for getting to the end. This is probably one of the longest that will appear in this series, and it does cover the fundamentals of one of the core aspects of the IBM Cloud, which you'll need to understand, especially if you're going to invite and have multiple users in your account. The next video will be a lab, and there I'll show you some of the screens for Cloud Foundry and IAM management, as well as how to invent and set up users in your account.